Is Leech finally dead? That's a question we're going to tackle in this review of the latest Marvel Snap patch notes. We've got some game updates and some balance changes as well. Cards like Leech getting nerfed, which I think a lot of people are going to welcome, but also cards like Leader getting buffed. Did we go from a Leech meta to a Leader meta? That's what we're going to talk about as we run through these patch notes. And in fact, let's go ahead and kick it off with the card balance changes in particular. I think these are probably the most impactful and important to most of you. So first up, for instance, is Shuri, and Shuri's keeping the same stat line as before, but now she's going to read on reveal, if you play your next card here, double its power. So she still has the doubling aspect, but in particular, you are showing exactly where that card's going to go, which can be important, giving your opponent a lot of information about, like, okay, look, they're going to play something really powerful there. I'm going to shift my resources elsewhere, maybe even going to like drop a Professor X elsewhere on turn 5. So some counterplays, both directly through those sort of lane lockdowns and manipulations, but also indirectly, just knowing where the power is going to be and perhaps tackling that head on with a preemptive Shang-Chi ready to go as soon as they drop that, depending on priority, of course, and sometimes just shifting your focus elsewhere. Beyond that, there's another really direct implication with Cosmo. Currently, these Shuri Red Skull decks will play Cosmo in one spot, Shuri somewhere else, and then dump that big Red Skull behind the Cosmo, protecting it from Shang-Chi or Valkyrie. But in this case, of course, you won't be able to Shuri on your Cosmo location, which means Cosmo no longer becomes a protection for that big Red Skull card. And then, of course, you can't Taskmaster the Cosmo lane either. So suddenly Cosmo becomes a real question in Red Skull decks, and they were using that to protect their assets in many cases. So might have to rely on things like armor, which opens room for Valkyrie, so on and so forth. So we've also got some developer comments saying very similar things, I think, to what I just said, but we'll read them anyway. We considered a number of changes to Shuri, but they all tended to ruin her current decks. Some even theoretically risk making a new monster with different parts. That's not a great risk to run when balancing a problematically strong card. The change we're making today may seem small and subtle, but we expect it to be impactful and retain the same flow of play for her existing decks, which is a consistent goal in our balance philosophy. This nerf removes Cosmo's protective capacity for her target, like we said, makes single card answers like Valkyrie easier to aim, and indirectly buffs lane control elements like Professor X. Okay, literally what I talked about. Okay, we're on the same page. We're taking a risk here that this nerf could leave Shuri still a strength outlier. If so, we'll react quickly. And I think this is a really interesting way to tackle this problem. You know, the raw output of Shuri remains the same, and the numbers can get just as big as they used to, but it kind of balances the card through information and manipulation, which is a neat direction to think about. So, like, skillful play, mindful play will be better against Shuri, but just raw dumb stats basically will be the exact same. But I think I like that philosophy, and I like that change. You know, a lot of people, for instance, also just paid a lot of tokens for Shuri, and they're attached to this card, and it's like the deck they play. So having it retain some of that raw output and base power will be a better feeling than a card just getting absolutely gutted, as we've seen in the past with cards like Leader, which again we'll talk about. So next up is Leech, and Leech is getting a significant change here. At the start of turn 6, remove all abilities from cards in your opponent's hand. And notably, this does not say on reveal. So I think this is like an on-board effect. It's not an ongoing effect because it's just a one-time trigger, but he's got to be on board. And then this will basically activate on turn 6 as long as he's on board on turn 6. And of course, this does a couple things right now when, say, Thanos decks cheat out Leech early via either ramp or via Lockjaw summoning. That can feel really frustrating. He's coming down on like turn 4 and your whole hand is basically ruined for 2 turns, and that just feels awful, and people concede the game and they leave. In this case, you've got a little bit of warning, basically, that this is coming. So if you have something particularly high value ability in hand, maybe something else that's fine if it gets leeched, you can kind of balance that out and play around it to some extent. Some decks will still have problems with that, of course, for specific combos or if all your cards have abilities you care about. But at least you'll have the ability to kind of address it and perhaps dump some power ahead of it and so on, and try to punish that to some extent. And then for the Leech player, of course, it still retains the ability to shut down those, oppressive turn 6s. If you're expecting a, She-Hulk or something, a death, and you want to make sure those cost the full amount instead of a discounted amount, you could still drop a Leech and ruin some of those turn 6 pop-offs. Same thing for Hit Monkey, whatever the turn 6 pop-off might be. So the developer comments here read, "It's never been our goal for Leech to be a heavily played card. Thank God. And we understand that's been a frustration lately. When it's happening, it usually means a finisher is generically strong against pure power, like Leech Leader, and or a deck can play Leech earlier than turn 5 too often, like Lockjaw Thanos. We've tried in the past to weaken the stronger cards in those decks, but it's been a balance and design obstacle. Thus, we've decided to remove the early Leech from the equation. Leech is designed to counter some powerful in-game cards and combinations from a unique angle without any setup, which is important to have around in those events, or in the event those decks begin to overperform. This change should let him fulfill that role when necessary without ever making him a foundational piece of the meta game." And that's a relief. I don't think we want to see Leech very often. I think the game is a lot less fun when that happens. So moving on to Lockjaw, staying at 3/2, has the exact same effect, except you can now only do it once per turn. So this will limit some of those like crazy pop-offs in a Thanos deck where you just drop 3 stones all at once, and sometimes you can still move Lockjaw to a new spot and do it a couple more times with a blue stone if you're trying to, and this will really limit that. So still interesting perhaps on turn 3 with something like a Wasp, and then maybe throwing 1 stone into it every turn, but limits that kind of swing out of it, and you can't just do it all by surprise on a final turn, for instance, to really catch somebody off guard. So just kind of limiting the output there, the capacity of Lockjaw to do big, crazy stuff. The comments here read, "Lockjaw is a fun and exciting card, but each trigger of this good boy basically draws a card and generates up to 6 energy at random. That's a lot of variance to have in multiple competitive decks. As we add cards, new and improved ways to sidestep Lockjaw's risk will also become available. Since we believe the most powerful and frustrating use of Lockjaw is triggering him multiple times in a turn, often with a snap along the way, we're changing that. Limiting Lockjaw to 1 swap each turn forces the player to develop their board without letting them sprint ahead or spring a late surprise. This will make Lockjaw simpler to play against and less potent in decks incidentally playing lots of cheap cards like Thanos." I think this is actually a pretty reasonable change. I actually think Lockjaw stays good as well. There are plenty of ways to structure a deck where you can weave together other energy fills. So, on turn 4, you play a 3 and a 1 on Lockjaw. On 5, you play like a 2-2-1 and so on, and still get a full Lockjaw as long as it comes down by turn 3. But perhaps, if you draw him on turn 5 or something, his impact is certainly reduced. But I think when you get him on 3 is when he felt the best anyway, and that'll still remain kind of a snap point for a lot of decks. And I think he'll still be good, just limited, which is the idea for nerfs. That's fine. Next up here is America Chavez, changing her functionality a little bit here. She's now going to start on the bottom of your deck, and you're going to draw her on turn 6. Now, before, the way Chavez worked was she would start anywhere in your deck, but you just couldn't draw her. So what would happen is, like, she might start in the first spot of your deck, or the 3rd spot of your deck, or the 5th spot of your deck, and she would just hang out there, and you would draw the card beneath her, and then the one beneath her. And eventually she would kind of filter her way to the top of your deck all the time because constantly other cards being pulled out from under her. And for the old days, for things like Jubilee, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit with this Jubilee change, that would mean that Jubilee very consistently pulled the top card of your deck, which was Chavez. They at one point changed that, so Jubilee just pulled a random card, not the top card of your deck. That also had impacts for things like Yondu. Yondu would basically always hit Chavez back in the day. Not literally always, but very, very often would hit Chavez for any top of deck effect. So now she's going to start at the bottom of your deck instead, and you're just going to draw her on turn 6. So for most use cases, you won't notice a difference. For cards that somehow reference the top of the deck, that'll somehow be occasionally be a little bit different. And in particular, this does actually affect Cable. Cable pulls from the bottom of the deck. So now cables are actually going to be likely to hit Chavez's very often, whereas in the past, like Yondus were very likely to hit Chavez often, which I think is a nerf for Cable. I don't think cables want to be grabbing Chavez's off the bottom of anybody's deck. You want awesome, good, playable stuff, not a garbage America Chavez that's probably only in your opponent's deck to help them find the right cards anyway. It's just, making their early game draw more consistent. So, interesting change here. I think this is basically forward-looking, and if you read these comments, I think that's what they suggest. Previously, if you're about to draw America Chavez, you would just draw your next card instead. This means that over the course of a game, she's a lot more likely to be the top card of your deck. Thus far, this has been largely unimportant outside of Yondu. but it does restrict our ability to print cards that interact with the top of your deck. We expect this update to have little impact on America Chavez's functionality overall. I think that's true. And this is really the takeaway, right? They're going to print cards that reference the top of your deck, and they don't want Chavez to always be the card at the top of the deck. So this is kind of future-proofing other card designs, it sounds like. Now, Jubilee is getting a similar kind of change, or in the same vein at least, in that she's going back to her old version and will now reference the top card of the deck, because no longer is Chavez a super consistent hit on that. Some of our players may remember a time when Jubilee had this ability. Back then, Jubilee would often be a 4/10, as she'd pull Chavez very consistently. We decided at the time to change Jubilee's effect instead of Chavez's, as the former was a much simpler change to communicate. However, we're looking to design cards that interact with the top of your deck in the future, so we're bringing this design back too, but we expect this update to have little impact on Jubilee for the time being. So these are both kind of not that meaningful now, but setting up for later. So next up, let's take a look here at Leader, and this is a really big change, I think. You recall Leader got nerfed, nobody's played him since. You had to like pick your spot, he only grabbed one location, very awkward. Now Leader is a 6/2, so losing some of those stats, but on reveal, copy the enemy card/cards with the highest power played this turn, but on your side. So if they play one big thing, you're going to copy that. If they play 3 things that are big, but all the same stats, so 3 like 5 power units, you'd copy all 3. If they played 1 10 and 2 5s, you'd copy the singular 10 power unit. So there is a chance to get multiple cards if they're all the same power, and that happens to be the highest power. So developer comments on this one: we were clearly too harsh on Leader with his previous nerf, and were dismayed that action became a go-to example for how ruinous a nerf can be. Our balanced philosophy is to preserve as much playability as we reasonably can when weakening cards, and we didn't succeed here previously. With this change, we're aiming to bring his strength back up to a playable spot for a 6-cost card, but still avoid the oppressive impact his original form had. We have erred on the side of the cautious side with this power for now, because some previous defenses against the original Leader, such as playing weaker cards before a strong one, no longer apply. So I think this is interesting, right? I think this has a chance to bring Leader back in certain decks that are playing from ahead. They go into that final turn in a good spot. You can use the 6/2 Leader to shore up a little bit, and then make sure you're contesting your opponent where they're going for their strongest. And a lot of decks just play the one big thing on the final turn. They drop a Dr. Doom, and you're going to match that Dr. Doom, power for power. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to see some decks return Leader to the forefront. I don't think he's going to be as powerful as before. Of course, being able to copy multiple things was really, really nice. And yes, he did have some play around potential by playing those small things first, but very often the board wasn't full enough for that to really be relevant or resolve in that way. So I do think Leader's got some real potential here again, which I don't know if people are going to be happy about. So we might have lost Leech, but we might have gotten Leader back. I don't know. Hopefully they're both just a little bit weaker. And even if Leader's better than he was, weaker than his original iteration, which of course people found very frustrating. So that wraps it up for the card changes. There were also some additional updates in this patch, namely some token shop updates here. These were previously teased, but now they're here. So there's a weekly spotlight where the new Series 5 card will be showcased. So you can always go grab that in the weekly spotlight. There's a new ultimate variants spot instead of mixing them into your token shop. And then Series 4 and 5 is basically going to be like the old token shop. And then Series 3 also got that change to the free once a month Series 3 card. There's a new game board update. Looks kind of spicy. There's like some cool new shiny lights and stuff in the background. Looks a little better. The series drop is here, of course. Ghost, Stature, and MODOK are going from 5 to 4. Stature's a handy card sometimes, but very specific, very niche. MODOK's a good card if you didn't pick him up in the season pass. Great for discard decks. Series 4 to Series 3, of course, Shuri and Bast and Valkyrie, all 3 fantastic cards, played a ton. Even Super Skrull and Black Panther, I think, have some utility as well. So pretty big Series 4 to Series 3 drop. Now, look, there's an elephant in the room, right? And it's a big elephant, and I think it's worth talking about. Shuri has been a dominant card for months and months and months. And Shuri drops to Series 3 the same day she finally gets nerfed. And that kind of sucks, right? Like, I know there's patch timings. I understand that these things take a while to implement sometimes. But listen, even if you're not like, you know, conspiratorial about it and you're not saying it's a, you know, a monetization gimmick or anything, it still kind of sucks, right? It's still a little bit unfortunate that a lot of people have probably been super excited to get Shuri for a long time, and they finally feel like they can as a Series 3 card, and she's nerfed. Or alternatively, you know, you finally got Shuri 2 weeks ago, and you were so excited, and you barely got any time to use her before she got nerfed. So, I mean, the optics here are really challenging regardless of the intent and the motivations behind it. It's a frustrating thing to see, and I think people will be frustrated by that, and I expect to hear a lot of frustration around the Shuri thing and a lot of accusations. I encourage you to ask questions, please. I think it's a useful thing to talk about and feedback that'll be useful for the Marvel Snap team to hear. Now, moving on to general updates. This one's good. Players that reach Infinite will only match against other Infinite ranked players. I know that's been a frustrating pain point for people. When you tap on a card for more details in the shop or collection, whoopsie, the card detail screen now features artist credits, card series labels, and variant rarity labels. That's handy. Particularly this stuff like barely existed in game, even though it was really important for your collection. When inspecting cards in game, you're gonna flip them over to see the card back in full detail. That's cool. After roughly 10 hours of gameplay today, players will stop earning Season Pass XP from gameplay for the remainder of the day. I'm sure some people will be frustrated about that, but honestly, 10 hours a day is a lot to be playing Marvel Snap. Might be for the best. I mean, I don't even think I play 10 hours in a day ever. Maybe sometimes grinding a lot, but very rarely. And then the collection track has been extended, which is good because I was actually getting kind of close to the end myself. I think it was at like 22,000. I was over 19, so I was getting nervous. And then some new audio changes as well. And then lots and lots of bug fixes, which of course I'm not going to read through all these, but lots of bug fixes if you guys are curious. I will link these patch notes down there in the description below. Curious to hear what you all think about these patch notes. These videos never get a lot of views, frankly, for Marvel Snap. My Hearthstone patch notes videos go crazy. Everybody loves them. But I don't have quite the quite the following for Marvel Snap patch notes. But maybe we'll get there someday. But either way, thank you, those of you who are watching. Hopefully you still find this useful and insightful and a nice little recap. So thank you. Appreciate you. Curious to hear what you think. And until next time, game on.